I'm back in the anechoic chamber at Bang & Olufsen to talk about a completely different aspect of room acoustics. But before we even talk about that, or before we go into real rooms and listen to some more demonstrations, I'm going to make some funny noises with a piece of wood on a table. If I take this piece of wood and I just snap it like this, I get a very short sound. It has basically no sound now. And then when I let go, it has a very sharp onset and a very sharp decay, and then it stops. So it has in time, I have nothing, 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 something, and then nothing forever. If you talk to somebody that works in acoustics or in audio, they'll call a sound like that an impulse. An impulse is, in theory at least, an infinitely short, infinitely loud click. The problem with that theory is that if it really is infinitely loud, then you will explode the universe, and that's bad because infinity is a long way to go. But what we normally do is we talk about a click as an impulse. So I can make an impulsive sound or an impulse in a bunch of different ways, but this is one way to do it. If I move the ruler on the table and do it again, I get a different sound. So that is also a measure or a demonstration of how this thing, this system, responds when I feed it with an impulse. I feed it with the impulse by lifting up and letting go. And it responds by coming down, hitting the table, and making a sound, and then going a little bit too far because it's heavy. And it's springy as well, so it bounces back up and then hits the table again and again and again. And each time it does that, it loses energy. I fed it energy when I lifted it up. And every time it bounces, it loses a little bit of energy. It loses it in at least two ways. One is the amount of sound that comes out, and that's not much. The other is heat. There's heat generated where it hits the table, and there's heat generated inside the wood itself. When it bends, it generates friction inside and makes heat. And as it loses energy over time, then those impulses that you hear decay over time. I've put the wood out so far that you can hear those impulses individually, a bit like the echoes we heard in the previous video. So if I do this again, you'll hear it click, and then click, and then click, and then click, and then click over time. That is a demonstration of the impulse response of this system. I feed it with an impulse and it responds like this. So I'm demonstrating the impulse response of this thing. If I change something in the system, let's say I made the wood heavier, then it wouldn't behave the same way. I would get a different impulse response. Or I could make the wood shorter. If I do this, now it still has individual clicks, but it doesn't last as long, and it happens more quickly because I've changed the length of the piece of wood that's being plucked here. If I change the length of the wood again, I get a different impulse response. I'll move it out. I get a different rate of decay and a different speed at which those impulses come in. So each time I change the system, it behaves differently. I feed it with the same thing. I still feed it with an impulse, and I get a different impulse response back. It responds differently to my impulse as I change things in the system. If I'm able to count fast enough, and I can't, then what I can do is count how many impulses per second are coming in. I can't count that quickly. I could look on the computer and find out when those spikes came in, but it really doesn't matter. The point is that I'm able to count the number of spikes per second, how frequently they come in. So I can tell the frequency of the repetition in impulses per second of this thing when I give it an impulse. If I lengthen the wood, then it will repeat itself slower, so I have a lower frequency. Because the frequency at which it's repeating itself is lower. There are fewer snaps per second. If I make this wood really short, and I do it again, we're still getting those impulses coming in, but they're coming in at a rate that's so fast, it could be in the hundreds per second. Bum, 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 bum. If those impulses are coming in fast enough, say more than 20 times per second or 20 hertz, then I don't hear it as individual impulses. My brain is not fast enough. So instead, I hear it as a tone, a note that I could even sing if I wanted to. Bum, 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 bum. The system is still behaving the same as this. It's just happening so quickly that I hear it as a completely different sound. Bop, bop, bop. So just like we talked about in part 1, what's happening here is a bit like film again. If I take a film and I slow it down enough, I don't see it as motion. I see it as individual still photographs. That's like this. I hear those impulses as individual things. But if I speed up the film enough, my brain is not fast enough to interpret that sequence of photographs as individual moments in time. So I see motion. And that's the same as when I speed this up enough to hear a note instead of individual impulses. The wood is still behaving the same way. It's just behaving at a different speed, and therefore my brain interprets it as a different thing. So before we go any further, we're going to do a quick review of 3 things. Firstly, an impulse response is how a system, like a piece of wood on a table, responds when you feed it with an impulse of energy like this. Secondly, if that impulse response repeats itself slowly enough, then I will hear those impulses as individual things over time, like this. But if the same system behaves exactly the same way, but fast enough, then I don't hear those individual impulses. I hear a note like this. I've now moved out of the anechoic chamber and into this room, which is a little strange. We have a reflective wall right behind the camera and another one down there. Those are just made out of drywall with plaster, and they're completely parallel. Basically, those are acting like acoustic mirrors, you could say. It's a hardwood floor, which is also reflective. And then we have the other 3 surfaces, which are very absorptive. We have velour curtains hanging on the side walls here, and an absorptive ceiling. What that means is that the sound of my voice is going out, and anything going in those directions or that direction will be absorbed and not reflect, and anything going in those directions or that direction will reflect. We're going to concentrate on this dimension for now. So the sound of my voice goes out, it reflects off of that wall, and eventually reaches that wall, reflects, and comes back about 75 milliseconds later, because that wall is about 13 meters away, give or take. The question is, what happens then? Because these 2 walls are parallel, the sound goes down, bounces back, and when it gets back here, we hear it, but then it bounces off of this wall, and we hear it again, and it heads back down to the other wall again. And it just keeps going back and forth. Because these walls are parallel, the sound wave bounces back and forth between the 2 walls until all of it is absorbed as heat. What that means is that you can hear the impulse response of this room if I snap my fingers. You can hear that echo bouncing back and forth in the room. You can probably hear it on my voice as well. Because that is a regular repetition in time, it sounds like a sound, and therefore we call it a flutter echo, because the sound is fluttering, appears to be fluttering back and forth. Right now, where we're standing and the way the camera and the microphone are turned, it doesn't sound like it's fluttering back and forth in the room because it's going this way. But what we'll do is turn the camera so that you can hear it as a left-right flutter echo. So now all I've done is rotate the camera, but I haven't moved it, so now we're still quite close to this wall. If I now snap my fingers, chances are you will only hear the flutter echo coming from the right-hand side. That's because the sound arriving at the microphone is so close in time to the reflection that comes off of this wall that you don't hear those as separate events, just like when we were very close to that wall in the football field. In essence, all we hear is the direct sound and then the echo off of that wall that keeps coming from that wall. But what I'll do now is take the camera and move it towards the center of the room, and we'll do this again. Now I'm about 1/3 of the way down the room. I'm not in the middle yet. The middle is still over here. I'll snap my fingers again, and now you should be able to hear that echo from both sides, because now that wall is far enough away that you can hear it as a separate echo. So now you can hear what I hear, which is the echo bouncing back and forth, fluttering in the room, which is why we call it flutter echo. Now what I'll do is take the camera and microphone and again move it so that I'll be as close to the middle of the room as possible, and we'll see what happens there. Now I've moved the microphone and the camera and me to what I hope is as close to the middle of the room as I can get. Now you probably hear a different sound than you did when we were 1/3 of the way up the room. The reason for that is that the sound of my voice goes out and it reaches that wall and that wall at the same time, bounces back and arrives back here at the same time. So what that means is that the reflection from that side and the reflection from that side match each other, both in time and in level, because the two walls are the same. Of course, I'm speaking theoretically, not practically. There are some differences. Those two reflections come in, they keep going, they hit the walls again, they come back, they get recorded, they go out, they come back, and so on. But because we're in the middle of the room, and because those two walls are identical, then through time, those reflections keep coming in at the same time. What that means is that there's no difference between the right side of the room and the left side of the room in the stereo recording. So in essence, what we're doing now, even though I'm using a stereo pair of mics in a room, I'm basically making a mono recording, because that side of the universe is identical to that side of the universe. This is a good reason why, if you're doing a recording of an instrument or a voice in a real room with a pair of microphones, you don't want to put everything in exactly the middle of the room, because if you did that perfectly, and if the room was perfectly symmetrical, and if the sound source was perfectly symmetrically radiating, then you would just make a mono recording. You want asymmetry in the, at least in the reverberation, to get a sense of spaciousness in the recording. Otherwise, you can save money and just buy one mic instead of two. What I'll do now is start snapping my fingers again so you can hear how this room sounds at this position, and then I'll move the microphone and do it in different places and get all the way back to the wall so you can hear that sound change, at least in terms of the width, as we're in different places in this room. I'll move the microphone and the camera down to about 1/3 of the way down the room. We'll do this again. We'll move closer to the sidewall, and we'll do it again. So now that wall is becoming more obvious because this wall is closer in time to the sound at the microphone. And I'll move all the way down to this wall and do it again. So now that we've gotten back to this wall, you can hear again that all of the echo appears to be coming from that side of the room, because this echo is so close in time that we can't hear it separately. So this room is a lot like that piece of wood that I was snapping on the table when the wood was very long. what was happening was that the wood was bouncing on the table so slowly that you could hear it as separate impulses. And that's basically the same as this room. When I snap my fingers, the amount of time it takes for the sound to get to the wall and back and forth again is so far apart in time that you can hear the impulse or the impulse response as separate impulses. But what happens if we take this room and we shrink it? If we do that, then we can get to a point where the reflections are going back and forth so quickly that you can't hear them as separate impulses, just like on that piece of wood. And at that point, this reflection, this flutter echo, will sound like something else. So let's go to a room like that and have a listen. Now I've obviously moved into a very small room. This room is about 1.2 meters by 2.4 by about 2.4 meters. 3 of the walls are drywall, so they're very reflective. This wall is glass. It's also very reflective. We've got a slightly absorbent ceiling and a slightly absorbent floor with some carpet on it. What's interesting is that this room is basically acoustically behaving the same as that last room we were in. The only difference is that when I send out an impulse, like that, the reflections come back so soon that we can't hear them as separate clicks like we did before. So because I'm about a meter away from this wall, I do that. The next reflection comes in as if I was only standing 2 meters away instead of 26 meters away like I was in the last room. What that means now is that we can't hear the impulse response as individual clicks. We hear it as what could be called reverb, but there's more to it than that. If you analyze the impulse response, so if you take that sound and look at it in terms of frequencies, you'll see that some frequencies are lasting longer than others. And those frequencies are the repetition of the impulse in this dimension, in that dimension, and a little bit in this dimension. The problem is that those are happening so quickly that we can't hear them as individual impulses. A computer can. A computer could see these as individual spikes coming in, but we can't hear them like that. So how can we hear them? Well, you can probably hear it right now. You can hear that I'm in a small room because some of the frequencies from my voice are ringing longer than others. And when they ring longer in time, they sound like they're louder because the sound from my voice that I just made a little while ago rings in time along with the extra ringing of whatever I'm saying now. And all of that piles up. If I really want to highlight that, all I need to do is to sing different frequencies and listen to hear how some notes are louder than others. So if I sing this note, it's not very loud. If I go down in frequency to the note where this room is ringing, there, that note is ringing all the time. So when I'm speaking like this, you hear that note. Even when I speak like this, you can hear that note ringing along with me all the time. It's not the only note that's ringing along, but it's constantly there, singing along with me. Basically, what's happening is that, like before, I'm sitting inside an organ pipe, and the sound of my voice is injecting energy into this pipe, and that's singing along at that note. So if I sing different notes, they'll result in different loudnesses because the room wants to sing along at some frequencies better than others. So that note that's ringing is called a resonant frequency, but usually we call it a room mode. It's the mode at which the room is trying to ring in one of its dimensions. And there are different types of room modes. There's one-dimensional modes where this room is ringing at this frequency defined by that distance, one at this distance and one at that distance. So those are the one-dimensional modes. But the room is also ringing at two-dimensional modes. So there's a reflection that goes around the room this way, one that goes this way, and one that goes this way. Those are the two-dimensional modes. And then we have a three-dimensional mode where it's going diagonally in the room across the corners, this way and this way, for example. And those are all happening at different frequencies. Because the room is singing at different frequencies caused by its different dimensions, I can find another frequency that's also singing along, not just this one, this note is not as loud as this note, because the room is singing along at this dimension. If I find a different frequency, there's another one. There's one there. There's another one. So there are many of these frequencies singing along all at once with my voice when I'm speaking. That also means they're singing along if I were a loudspeaker playing music at the listener. Now I'm obviously in a much larger room than I was before. This room is a bit strange. It's very reflective. The walls, ceiling, and the floor are all made of concrete, although there's a thin layer of carpet on the floor. The width and the length of this room is very big. This is quite a big room. But the ceiling is quite low because it's in the basement. What that means is that the resonant modes of this room in the length and the width dimensions are very, very low. In fact, they're so low we wouldn't hear them as modes. This would be more like the room with the flutter echo in it, except that we don't get flutter echo in this room because the walls are irregular, so the reflection goes in different directions rather than straight back and forth across the room. You can probably hear that this room has got some reverberation. And what's interesting about that reverberation is that the resonant mode of the height is very audible. I love this room, not because it sounds good in here, but because it sounds so unique. The resonant mode of the height actually plays a C major chord because it doesn't just play the resonant frequency, the fundamental frequency of the height, but 2 times that and 3 times and 4 times and 5 times and so on up the harmonic series. So you don't just hear one note that's ringing along, you hear all of its harmonics ringing along as well. So if I sing a sweep that includes all of those notes, you'll hear them ringing in time much longer than all the other notes, like this. Whoop! Whoop! So what you can hear ringing in time in the room, and what you hear is what I hear, this is the room singing along with me right now, is a C major chord, give or take, with a flat 7th, which is the fundamental, then the octave, the 5th, the octave, the 3rd, 5th, and flat 7th. So that's 7 harmonics in the overtone series, ringing in the vertical dimension of this room with everything that happens in here. Imagine if I had a pair of speakers in here and I was playing music, then you would hear that C7 chord ringing along all the time with everything you listen to. This is a really good example of why you would want to use room compensation to try and do something about this. Ultimately, of course, in a room this bad, you would want to fix the acoustics of the room. You'd want to put in an absorber, probably on the ceiling, to soak up that problem. But if you can't, and in a case where it's not this bad, you can change the timbre of your loudspeakers to compensate for that problem. And we'll talk about that in a future video. I've come back to this hallway to talk about one last slightly strange thing. Everything I've talked about in this video up to now has dealt with reflections bouncing back off of walls or surfaces. This hallway, mostly, is made like the other rooms that we've seen in this video. That wall is glass, that's concrete, we have hardwood, and more concrete up on top. So all 4 of those surfaces are reflecting the sound that's coming from my voice right now. The sound goes out, it bounces off of these things, and it comes back again. But if I snap my fingers, hopefully you can hear that there's a reflection coming from the other end of this hallway. What's interesting is that that reflection is not bouncing off a surface at the other end. It's bouncing off the open end of the hallway, and that seems kind of strange for the reflection to be bouncing off of nothing. But let's think about this for a second. Let's invent a party game. We'll get everybody at the party to line up one in front of the other, and everybody's going to put their hands on the shoulders of the person in front of them. The game is that the person at the back of the line pushes the person in front of them, and that person pushes the person in front of them, and so on and so on and so on. The other rule is that you can't let go. So if I push, I have to keep holding. Now we'll put the person at the very front of the line up against a wall. So if I push the person in front of me, and they push that person, and they push that person, and they push that person, and so on, until the person at the front gets pushed, that person will push against the wall, and everybody gets pushed back. So if I shorten that time and get rid of the chain reaction, I push somebody, and eventually I get pushed backwards because the person at the front was up against a concrete wall. That's the same thing that happens when I send out a click. The sound goes out, it bounces off a glass wall or a concrete wall or something hard. I send out a high pressure, I push the air molecules, and what comes back is the air molecules getting pushed against me. Let's do the same party trick, but we'll put that person at the front of the line on the edge of a cliff. So now I push the person in front of me, they push somebody, they push somebody, they push somebody, and out at the front of the line, that person falls off the cliff, which pulls the person in front of, behind him, which pulls that person, which pulls that person, and eventually I get pulled forward. So now if I shorten the chain reaction, I push somebody, and eventually I get pulled forward. That's what's happening in this hallway. So I send out a high pressure, so I push the air molecules in that direction, and that pushes an air molecule, and that pushes an air molecule, until eventually at the end of the hallway, an air molecule gets pushed and it falls out into that big room out there. When it falls out into the room, like the person falling off the cliff, it pulls a molecule, and which pulls, and by the time it gets back here, the air molecule pulls away from me. So I send out a high pressure and I get back a low pressure of the same shape. I can't hear that difference. So I send out a click and I hear a click. What I don't know is that the click that went out was positive and the click that came back was negative. I can't hear that. All I can hear is an echo. If we scale all of this down, then the rooms that I've been in that have hard walls, say concrete and concrete, those are ringing at some frequency that's determined by the width of the room. That's because the reflection takes some time to get back and forth across the width, and that causes a resonance at a frequency that I can hear. If I scale that down, it's the same as having a pipe that has a cap on both ends, and it will sing at that note that's determined by the length of the pipe. There are organ pipes like this where you have a cap on both ends, and the length of the pipe determines the note that it sings at. If you had an organ pipe that was the same length as the room is wide, then the room and the organ pipe would both sing at the same note. Standing in this hallway is a bit like being very, very small and standing inside the mouthpiece of a clarinet. If I snap my fingers, the sound goes down, it bounces off the open end and comes back, just like in a clarinet, the reed opens, sends a puff of air down, and that bounces off the open end of the clarinet and comes back. So in both cases where you have either hard walls on both sides or you have a tube that's open on at least one end, then you will get some kind of resonance in that system that will sing at some note.